the cloud. All right, so what we're going to do is basically today is just going to be talking about ways in which the notions of public and private and what gets done publicly and privately is different thanks to modern technology. And because of that, and specifically the ethical considerations that come out of that. So what is it for something to be public versus private? And I don't mean private in the sense of privacy like we talked about a few classes ago. What is it? So what, either examples of things that are public versus private ones, or what is the definition of something public versus private?
Well, isn't public government run and private is like individual based, like well, not government run, I guess.
So part of it is government run. So private is, so church versus government would be one version of it, but private is, I'm gonna put up individual based. So that's part of it. But generally speaking, what is it about the government that makes it a public?
I have a question. You mean like companies or like public things that are shared publicly and things that are private?
No. So not the sense of information being shared publicly and privately, and not like the sense of a publicly traded company, but rather public in the sense of what the government is, as opposed to private in the sense of what Nike is. And it actually says the public has the right to it. So that's the key with a public one. The key to a public is it's things like the government, in which everyone has a right to it, versus an individual base, which is only members have a right to it. Now, what constitutes a right to it? Well, it depends on what type of thing we are talking about being public or private. So, what do I mean by that? Well, there's different types of public versus private things. So one thing we could talk about is a park. So what is the difference between a public park and a private park? When we say everyone has a right to it, what does that right entail? Access. So when we're talking about places, what we mean by public is access. Versus a private place, what is the difference? Who has access to a private place? So for instance, so members, or another private place is the Baruch campus. Who's allowed on the Baruch campus? Yeah, people who have a little card that let them in or they get to check in. So places is about access. So over here, it's access to all versus access to a select list. Now, it's not just places though. So let's talk about companies. So when we say that a company is private or an organization is private, what does that mean as opposed to an organization or institution that's public?
I forgot the word, but like the money that you get out of it is only for whoever works and not like.
Yeah, so that's part of it, is it's about how the money gets spent and what the money's for. So in a private company, it's typically that the money is being aimed back into the company. So it's kind of a closed system, but that's not necessarily the case, because there are some private companies that like charity groups and things would count as private companies in certain sorts of senses. They're a special type of like non-taxable sort of institution, but they still count as private. So what is it? So what does the government have, or what is true about the government that isn't the case for, say, Nike or Apple or any of these companies, Facebook, or I guess Meta now, or whatever we're supposed to call them?
Okay, you're asking what's the difference between the government and what?
Yeah, the public institution of the government versus these private companies. What is it that sets them apart?
Information about themselves.
So information about themselves. Say a little bit more what you mean by that.
It's a hard distinction because both are pretty private. I mean, like the government is really not either. But they're pretty transparent, I feel.
And specifically though, not even in terms of the transparency. So that's a part of it. What is it about a public institution that is supposed to be more transparent, where you're supposed to be able to go to the website and they'll tell you things? Why is that the case? In the sense of everyone has a right to it. With a public institution like the government, what is it that you all have a right to?
I mean, is it because it's funded by tax?
So it's basically, in a certain sense, it's tax funded, but more importantly, it's that in some very broad sense, you have some type of say in it if it's a public institution. It applies to everybody. Yeah, so you have a say in how it's run, at least in a democratic state. Now, it's not a perfect decision making, like you don't get to make all the laws. Rather, you vote for someone who then makes the laws. But you have much more control than over a private organization like Nike. Like you do not get any vote in what Nike does on a daily basis. All you can do with Nike is buy shoes or clothes. So with public places, it's about access to all. With public companies or institutions, it's right to decide how it's run. With a private company, so everyone has a right to have for all. With a company like Nike or a company like Apple or a company like Meta, who gets to decide how it gets run? CEOs. Basically, in a grand scheme of things, it's anyone who owns stock or is a partial owner of a company. Now, how much you own determines how much say you have, but anybody who is owns any percentage of a company gets a say, but anyone who owns no percentage gets no say whatsoever. So private companies or institutions, only owners get a say, and maybe some employees, but you have to be actively tied in here. So that's the key here about the difference between public and private. Public is something that has access to all, be it a place or an institution where everyone gets a say in how it's run. By contrast, a private place, only people are allowed in if they have special permission, they're on the list. And if it's a private institution, only people who are partial owners of it get a say. So with this in mind, I now want to, so everyone, I'm gonna slide this board out of the way. Any questions?
With a private company, doesn't a private company usually rely on the public's opinion? So at least suggestions have a big play into it. Not that they have to listen to it, but I feel like a lot of their success is based off of what the public thinks.
So part of it is public success, but the key difference here is that it's a separate, it's a step removed. Right. So in a public, you vote for a person, and this person makes the decisions. Over here, what happens is the public makes a decision or the public does things based on what the public decision is. Votes are made by the people within the company. Those people within the company, then it goes up to the CEO, and then in this way the decisions get made. So it's just one more step removed. So it's in a governmental case, I actively partake in the decision-making process by choosing people. With a private company, I can choose to buy their shoes, and in so doing, I show whether I like Nike or not. But my decision does not directly determine what they decide in the boardroom or how it gets determined. So even if everyone decides Nike is my favorite shoe, it's not necessarily going to change things within Nike. If, for instance, everyone says, I refuse to, to go with a case. So for instance, say it turns out that a certain company is incredibly racist, like the ownership group is incredibly racist. This becomes public information. Now the public might find out and decide, I don't want to buy this company's vodka anymore, and therefore their sales go down. Now, that there might influence the decision of the board to say, let's get rid of this CEO. But if the board decides, we don't care that we're racist, we're going to keep doing everything the same, nothing's going to change. Their sales might go down, but it's not going to actively affect the change here. So public and private, what did I say our first topic was going to be what did I say last class would be our first topic today? Anyone remember? Cancel culture. Yeah. And why am I talking about cancel culture in the context of public versus private? Well, what is the definition of cancel culture? What is it, or an example of cancel culture? When people are talking about cancel culture, what do they have in mind? And I'm opening this up. What do people mean when they say cancel culture?
That something goes public and viral.
So
and your perception of in society is bad, and then lose like money, jobs.
So here's the thing. So you can think of it as a few steps. One, someone says something offensive. Can you see this, board people or computer people, or do I have to move it down? I think I have to move it down. So step one, someone says something offensive. Step two, people's views change. Step three, lose money, jobs, etc. This is generally what we mean by cancel culture in a general sense. Now, there's a couple more steps here. There's a step between 2 and 3 in a certain sense. But generally speaking, this is what we're talking about: losing jobs, losing money, etc. But the key here is what would you call these sorts of things? You can think of them as punishments. These are punishments or reprimands for certain sorts of actions. So this is what people mean by cancel culture. Anyone got any examples they just want to throw up here so we can have a particular thing to talk about?
It's like punishment. So basically, when someone you said someone says something offensive, that's the only way to get cancel culture, really.
Yeah, so it's you say something so offensive or so upsetting. Yeah, so comedians will often get canceled. If a comedian gives a joke, yeah, Dave Chappelle is in a semi-canceled state for some of the things he said. So this sort of thing is the key. Someone says something that's offensive, it causes the public's opinion of that person to change. And also that change then leads to this person losing money, losing jobs, etc. Now, here's the key. So here's another case. I were to say, walk down the street, I see one of you, and as a greeting, I punch you in the face. I give you a concussion, black eye, you're in the hospital. That's a case in which I've done something. It's not really offensive, it's just assault. People's views are changing of me and I get punished. But would we want to say that's cancel culture, really? Where I then go to jail. Is that cancel culture? No, it's not cancel culture if I'm just getting punished by the law. So what's the key about cancel culture? It's like not that it's something being instituted by the law enforcement. Where is this punishment coming from?
It's coming from the public. It's coming from like your peers, and it's like holding them accountable.
So it's about public. So it's really two separate things with this punishment. And really 2 and 3 go hand in hand, where it's really 2. So 2 and 3 in one way is 2 causes 3, but in another way, the 2 can often go hand in hand. Like you can lose the money and the jobs even before people get offended about it. So it's really that the punishments come in the form of either public opinion or who is it that's taking your job away? Who is it that's taking the job away? Is the government stepping in?
Right, an employer.
Your employer, that's the key. So it's because of the public opinion, but the person who actually fires you is the private company you work for. So that's the other case with cancel culture. Now, sometimes it can be if you're working for the government and you get removed because of something offensive, it would be a public company. But generally speaking, it's the public opinion at a private company that is making the decisions of how you should be punished and what the punishment should be.
You said the key word is affiliation.
So yeah, it would be a private company that you're affiliated with in some way will get rid of you, or a public opinion.
Like, let's say the reason the private entity fires you is because they don't want to be affiliated.
Exactly. Yes, that is the key idea. It's whatever private company. And so they will punish you if they are affiliated with you, and either A, they want to punish you, or more often, they don't want to be affiliated with you because that will hurt their public opinion, which will end up hurting, if Nike keeps around a bunch of racists in their CEO position, people aren't going to want to buy Nikes. Therefore, it'll cost them money. So they decide we will fire you before you can possibly do something that is going to affect our Nike's bottom line. So that's the idea with cancel culture. And what's the major difference then between cancel culture versus our traditional ways of punishment? So a traditional way or let's think of a country in which say offensive things, hate speech, are not simply frowned upon, but are actually illegal. So let's say France, where selling swastikas is actually illegal. What is the difference between that and cancel culture?
One's under law and one's under.
Yeah, so one is under law and one's under public opinion. So what are the practical differences then? So what are the differences between having the punishment be public opinion and private versus it being determined by the law?
No, like, no jail time, no, like, don't have to pay any. You know.
Fines and things,
Yeah.
yeah. So on the one hand, you aren't going to go to jail for things in the court of public opinion. So that's one issue that's different. Also, you're not literally going to be paying a fine to the government. But does that necessarily mean that getting canceled is better, or what are, Olivia?
No, I don't think so, because I feel like people could easily be swayed by like one person's, if like one person's like, oh my gosh, this person's like terrible. Everyone's just gonna like jump on that bandwagon to like create something.
Yeah, so here's one thing. So let's just, I'm gonna erase this and we can just talk about like facts about cancel culture, both for better, worse, and different. So one way in which cancel culture is different from the law is that in a case where it's illegal, what is your punishment for, say, selling swastikas? Well, it's written down on a piece of paper. It's the same for everyone. It's very clear. If you are found out to have Nazi sympathies, what exactly is your punishment going to be within a cancel culture situation?
You're socially punished.
You're socially punished, but what exactly does that look like?
People don't want to interact with you, your job. Nobody
Yeah,
wants
so
to
you
get
get
with
shunned, you don't want to be interacted with, but could you tell me exactly how many of your friends are going to leave you? Can you tell me exactly how many people will stop talking to you? Can you tell me exactly whether you will lose your job or not? Can you tell me whether one day you'll get a job again? What am I highlighting here? So what?
It's tentative.
It's very tentative. It's very unclear. So the difference here is in a law where there's a law as punishment, things are pretty clear cut. There's a set amount of jail time that's minimum, set amount of jail time that's maximum. There's a certain amount of fines you're going to pay. Within a cancel culture situation, it's very, very difficult to predict exactly what the consequences are going to be, which can have both positives and have negatives. So to go with Olivia's case, sometimes when somebody engages in does something and all of a sudden there's a public backlash that says, you know, this person's terrible. What are sometimes the things that end up happening? What are some of the things that you've heard about? So this was, Sachi said, there was one girl that wrote something on Twitter and she got on a plane. When she landed, there were over 1,000 texts because the tweet she had said went viral and then she got fired. So that's a case in which like all of a sudden you end up with a huge amount of like Twitter backlash.
Well, also, Kevin Hart lost he was supposed to the Oscars and then he lost that job. Well, after and again, he didn't want to do it anymore, but he lost that originally the tweets that he had like a long time ago.
Yeah, so that's the case. You lose these sorts of opportunities. So any sort of public facing situation you end up losing. What,
Do you think it's tentative between each person as well?
say that again?
Do you think it's tentative between each?
Absolutely. So it's very so this is a part of the thing. The first thing I want to say about cancel culture is it's cancel culture, very unpredictable and uneven. So it really comes down to like a big thing is who finds out that you did the offensive thing. If the person who finds out is somebody with 10 Twitter followers, you're not going to get canceled very hard. While somebody else who does something just as or equally as offensive, but the person who finds out has 10 million Twitter followers, you might be canceled while the other person who did the exact same thing you did not. So it's very unpredictable and uneven. Also, say you sell a Nazi flag in France and the punishment, I don't know what the punishment actually is, but say it's 1 year in jail. It's a total of 6 months to 1 year in jail. Imagine that's a punishment. I don't think that's actually it. What is the best case scenario for you?
Go to jail for 6 months.
Exactly. And what's the worst case scenario for you?
Go to jail for a year.
Go to jail for a year. Now think about cancel culture. If you do something, say you post a Nazi flag on your Twitter, what's the best possible outcome for you? punishment wise?
Nobody sees it.
Nobody sees it and there's no punishment at all. Or somebody does see it and they think, oh, he was just joking, she was just joking, they were just joking, no punishment. What's the worst possible punishment?
Someone gets offended,
Someone gets offended, but once someone starts getting offended, what happens next?
anything.
That's the key. Anything. So it's not just unpredictable of how it gets punished. You've heard of, there have been stories of somebody who says something offended or offensive and ends up, one, losing their job, two, getting shunned completely, three, they get death threats, their family gets death threats, all their public or all their private information gets posted to the internet. They start getting messages that say things like, don't ever show your face again or we're going to kill you. Their children start getting harassed at school. So that's another big difference with cancel culture, is it's very, very unpredictable, both in terms of who gets punished and then also what the minimum and maximum level of punishment is. If there's a law, it's pretty clear. And one of the reasons that I think cancel culture gets people so up in arms is the fact that there doesn't seem to be a very close correlation between how bad the thing someone does is and what level of punishment they get. And so it's very, very, so I think, as I said last time, there are certain sorts of cases where I think even the most anti-cancel culture person can recognize in a particular case, it's right that this person got canceled. So like if we go to Harvey Weinstein before he went to jail, everyone know what happened with Harvey, the whole story. All right, I'm not going to repeat it then. We can all look at that and think like that person is somebody who it's a good thing that that person stopped being an executive in Hollywood who was taking advantage of people and was fired. And we can all look at that and say that is a positive case. The issue is that we can also all think of cases in which somebody does something significantly less bad and the punishment doesn't seem to line up with it. So a case in which somebody tweets something when they were 16 and they end up losing a job when they're 40. At the very least, it's not a clear-cut case that if this person at age 16 and along those 24 years has come to have very different views, or somebody at age 12 went to a party dressed a certain way, that was, we look at, and that person is genuinely upset about it. Maybe we think they should be canceled, but it's certainly not a very clear-cut case. Nothing.
It doesn't need space for like growth and like or to be.
Exactly. And that's the thing about cancel culture is it ends up that it's very difficult for, like, even the law has statute of limitations. So for instance, if you commit a felony burglary in, like, you steal, say, $1,000 in cash, usually you cannot go to jail. Like, if you don't get charged until 10 years later, they generally can't charge you. So the law recognizes that people can change. Now, there are certain types of crimes that have no statute of limitations, like murder. If you murder someone at age 12, you can still go to jail for it at age 60. But if you rob someone of $2,000 at age 12, you cannot go to jail at age 40. Cancel culture, by contrast, seems to go on forever. If somebody gets offended by it, and this is the other thing, is that because of the fact that it's tied in with what your affiliation with a company is going to possibly get rid of you, not for considerations of whether this is fair or not, but just because they don't even want to take the chance of being affiliated with somebody who might affect their bottom line. So even if a tweet comes out 12 years ago, if the company wants to fire you, they're going to, even if they're not certain it's going to affect their bottom line, just because they don't want to take that chance. And so that's another element of it, is it seems like cancel culture, just the punishments can be incredibly strong in cases where the crime wasn't necessarily as bad. And even if you do say that the crime is as bad, there's still no real connection between one and the other. And then here's the other thing I want to talk about, it with the private side of things. And this kind of ties in with, so if a company fires someone for saying something offensive because they are affiliated with that person, what is the number one determiner of whether they're going to fire that person or not? What is the number one factor that they are going to judge? How are they going to go about making this decision? Say the CEO makes a very offensive tweet.
They get pressure from the public to also act on it.
And so pressure from the public. And why does that public pressure matter? Why don't they just say, we don't care what the people think?
Because the public has something to do with how the private anything is like run. And he said that the private companies, they like to keep their money inside, and yeah, I'm missing my point. I'm sorry.
No, it's okay. You said the key word. The
Yeah.
key word is money.
Yeah.
Why is it that, so here's a question. So how many of you have seen those Nike commercials within like the past 12 months that star Colin Kaepernick, former NFL quarterback? Have people seen these advertisements? Oh, Gotti, is that a yes or is that a question?
It was a yes. It was a yes.
Yeah. So why is it that Nike was silent for the time when Colin Kaepernick was actually a quarterback?
Because it wasn't clear to the public that he got rid of that.
Exactly. For those of you online, Netta said it wasn't clear what the public felt about Colin Kaepernick. It was only after Nike decided it was going to be a good business decision for them to associate with Colin Kaepernick that they started associating with Colin Kaepernick. If they had really cared about it entirely from a social justice standpoint, they would have stepped forward immediately and said, we stand with Colin Kaepernick. However, the worry was if they said that, a large number of people would stop buying Colin Kaepernick or stop buying NFL paraphernalia from Nike. So instead, what they did was they waffled and said something along the lines of, this is a complex situation and blah, blah, blah. And then once after last spring happened with the Black Lives Matter movement really catching steam last spring, that's when companies becoming more behind it, they decided our business decision, it is going to be more beneficial for us as a private company now to decide who gets, like, we now want to be associated with him.
It's almost like it changed things to the fact that you have to accept it for you to be also acceptable. It's also like wasn't public.
Yeah, and so here's the thing. When you have public opinion combined with monetary concerns, what ends up happening is who gets punished starts being responsive to facts that have nothing to do with how bad the crime was. It's entirely then a matter of how much people get mad and how much that madness of people affects the well-being of the private companies with whom those people are associated. It's actually
People's opinion also change, and so that sways a lot. So there's constantly the change in opinion. So somebody is being punished for something that happened 12 years ago because it was online and it just stayed. It's just unfair to the person.
absolutely, yeah. And that's another thing, is the law is relatively stable. But with public opinion, as soon as public opinion shifts, the punishment shifts. And this is how you can end up with cases of people who get canceled and then uncanceled and then recanceled and then uncanceled and recanceled. Or another thing is, if it doesn't hurt the bottom line, you can have people saying as offensive stuff as you can imagine who never get canceled. So for instance, Trump was basically cancel proof. And why was he cancel proof? Well, he was cancel proof because no matter how much the things he said offended people, there was enough of a group of people who liked what he was saying that he was still a good monetary bet. Basically, he still got enough support and enough attention that no matter how many people wanted to cancel him, they couldn't get enough people behind it to actually ever get him to not talk until finally Twitter stepped in and shut off his Twitter account. But that's something we'll get to in a minute. So do you see here how what ends up happening with cancel culture is, even if you say that there's a lot of cases in which it's good, the number one determiners of cancel culture no longer are fairness or justice or equality for everyone. It ends up being money and opinion, and opinions can change and are very easy to manipulate. And money is going to be very tied to public opinion. So very often, like the Harvey Weinstein situation, people knew in Hollywood about Harvey Weinstein for years. Like, it's not like this was suddenly a surprise. There were rumors about it. But why didn't he get fired? Well, up until the point at which he finally got fired, people decided it was a better monetary bet to have a movie associated with his name, as long as the general public didn't know the facts, than it was to do the right thing and fire him. So that's the worry around cancel culture. It is a very powerful tool that when applied well can be very useful, but it's just so, because it's associated with private companies and public opinion as opposed to a set of laws decided in the classic way, it's just very messy. So everyone on board with the cancel. So does anyone have any views on how cancel culture should be altered, what can be done, or is this just one of those things where like, does anyone have any thoughts on this, generally speaking? Olushola, then Kyriakos, then
Okay,
Sakshi.
so I was just thinking that the way we handle private situations in court is kind of similar to the way we handle cancel culture. Because just how somebody can get canceled, they can get uncanceled. And he's also talked about redemption for the private court cases. When it comes to cancel culture, you want as much redemption as you can get. So you're gonna try and get it. So Kevin Hart, yeah, he didn't go back to that role, but like, let's say he actually wanted to go back to it. He can say or do something to change his situation.
So I think that's a good point. I was giving kind of a pessimistic view of cancel culture, but it does seem like there are people who have achieved some level of redemption. And it does seem like it's not like you have absolutely no control over this. It's an unwieldy beast that can be very difficult to control. And sometimes it does prove almost impossible if in the wrong situations.
But I also think that there's also bias in like who gets to be redempted.
Yeah.
Like, and that's it.
Yeah, and so I think that's another thing is like there is also like just basic tendencies of like so to go with another classic NFL case, the NFL every year or so it comes out that some player has beat the living shit out of his significant other. So like that comes out once a year, and whether the guy comes back to the NFL or not, like, so whether the NFL as an organization cancels him, very rarely has anything to do with how bad the crime was. It rather generally has to do with how good is this person at football. And generally speaking, if somebody is very good at football, most teams will be willing to look past how much this person beat the crap out of their significant other. And the guys who get totally kicked out of the league are the ones that aren't that good anyway. Olivia.
Just like have to do with, like powerful people in general. Like for instance, like I think about like R. Kelly and how he was kind of canceled definitely, but I feel like he was before he was really like held accountable for his actions. I feel like it went on for a really long time.
So I think that that's a really good point. So R. Kelly and his pedophilia and exploitation of underage women, that's a case in which, in some ways, what to point out with cancel culture is even if we think of it as an improvement in a lot of ways, and I think a lot of people who are talking about cancel culture talk about it as we now have ways of punishing these powerful people. Well, on the flip side, it's still a matter of who gets punished and how is very much tied into how much power you have to begin with. So like the only reason R. Kelly was able to eventually get punished, while before he was powerful, was eventually he was no longer like the #1 star and the evidence just became overwhelming. Well, I think with cancel culture, if you become someone who's good at manipulating public opinions, you can also prevent yourself from getting canceled in a way which is very unfair. And like generally speaking, if you're a good looking person, you're less likely to get canceled. If you're very good at your job, you're less likely to get canceled. Kyriakos, you had something before and I want to make sure you have it. We can also come back.
I think I was going to say cancel culture can't be changed because like if you have to change cancel culture, you have to change like the way human psychology works.
Yeah, and I think that's the thing. The only way I could see cancel culture really getting changed would be if we were to find another way to regulate the internet and human behavior in a mass media setting. So the reason cancel culture has stepped in is just because nobody else has stepped in to stop internet behavior.
You see it as a wave, like, hey, one person thinks this and then it starts exponentially growing, and then the only reason people care about it is because it's so big, and then they care about what the public or that wave is going to think of them if they don't agree with the public.
Absolutely. So this is a really good point of why cancel cultures also can be so strong, is it ends up being like a self-fulfilling prophecy. So Sakshi says, who would regulate it? Here. And I think that's another point of like, how could you regulate this? And we're going to talk in a little bit about like, why is the internet so damn hard to regulate? But so yeah, it's with cancel culture, it ends up being a self-fulfilling prophecy where if somebody does something a little bit bad, And it should lead to a public debate about what should we think about this person. Instead, what will very often happen is there will be a few people initially who start talking about how bad it is, at which point more people will then have heard this person did something bad. So now it's growing. And once people, the public opinion is starting to share, if you don't step on in the same way as everybody else, as a company, you might be worried. So what can end up happening is the movement from doing something small bad, which should lead to a public discussion, instead very quickly snowballs into complete cancellation. PRX.
Do you think the feminist movement, from what it's become, has become an entity of cancel culture in itself?
So no, I don't want to think, so I don't want to say that any particular movement
Not any
is,
particular, but I'm saying
or,
movements that have made such great strides in so little time. Do you think a lot of that has to do with cancel culture?
so I would be tempted to say, I'm not sure if it's cancel culture or more that it's a matter of like internet communication in general has allowed these groups to mobilize, and social media. And I think it's the sort of thing where part of that, like, so here's what I'd say. Here's social media. Social media has led to many things. One of them is the growth in things like, so let's just use feminism as an example. Feminism, hashtag me too. And I think these things largely were able to come into existence in their new forms through social media. Now, I think social media has also led to something like cancel culture. And I think there are some ties here in between them, but I don't want to say that this is being driven entirely by that. I'd want to say that there are complex interactions, but like any sort of thing, I think it's social media leads to cancel culture, it leads to feminism, it leads to white nationalism. I think all of these are separately sorts of things that, thanks to social media, get driven. And cancel culture has interactions in all of these ways. So I think it's just a separate sort of issue.
I have two things to say. I think also, first of all, I think it's dangerous when we take it upon ourselves to be like the judges, because sometimes we might judge people more. Like we would want to have, again, depending on what we do, but like we would want to have a second chance. And so that's, I think that's dangerous. And second of all, I think that now when you ask the question before, like, what do people look for, like, if you did something wrong, like how can you then not be canceled? I think what people are looking for is for you to show that you did, that you changed. So for example, Nick Cannon had a talk show thing and he interviewed somebody and he perpetuated some anti-Semitic stereotypes there. And then he was canceled for like 24 hours. And then he did a different podcast with a rabbi that explains to him why that would be not great to say.
So yeah, and I think that's right. Is and the way in which so working backwards, for those of you online, if you couldn't hear Netta, what she was talking about was cases in which what people want to see to get uncanceled are instances in which someone shows a genuine desire to learn and respond. And I think that's entirely right. And I think that is the best way to get uncanceled. And is basically the only way, is if somebody shows a genuine interest or a recognition that they've done bad things and truly want to be better about it, or are aware of their own problematicness. That is the main way. However, there is still then, I think, issues of what can end up happening is you end up with the non-apology apologies, and you have the cases in which, like, can you really trust when somebody with a PR?
That's what I was about to say. It's like, it's more like a PR crisis, like, let me fix this first before, but it's still, I don't know.
Yeah, and so I think that's the other thing is like the way in which we could respond to cancel culture, the solution opens up the way for also those, you know, big PR speech of we care so much about diversity here at blah, blah, blah. We in fact hire blah, 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 blah. And then it just ends up being like, we end up being unable to recognize the true attempts to be better because of these.
I think people are saying like if there's not a real action behind like an apology statement, then there's not, then that doesn't.
And I think another thing with cancel culture that is tough is for companies and things, people have short memories. So if you can weather the first storm, it oftentimes doesn't actually lead to lasting change. So for instance, like many companies came out and said, we support Black Lives Matter, but it doesn't seem like many of them did much more than release a PR statement in a lot of cases. It doesn't seem like many of them tried, because once the public wave of opinion, the wave of public opinion shifted, and they're no longer in the crosshairs, things like cancel culture does not always lead to genuine change in the way that the law does. It instead leads to people doing whatever it takes to look like they've changed so that they are in line with public opinion. Yeah, change your profile picture. All right, Sakshi, you had something before. I want to make sure that you get to say it.
Sorry, I was just gonna say that social media is causing all of this, and unless social media, finds a way to control it, like the point you made, but also like I don't feel like there's any way to sort of control it. It's just that people have the power, but now they're also able to abuse it because that's the flip side of power. Sorry, I have a 6-month-old puppy. That's
Tell your puppy we all say hi.
Thank you.
Yeah, so I think, and I want to jump into that next of like, why is it so hard to regulate social media? And why is it that like, so social media is another way in which this public-private change has really happened that's worth highlighting, especially in the context of a democracy. But Olushul. Okay. Oh, hi there, puppy. Oh, hi there. It's really cute. All right. So what I want to talk about next is another way in which the relationship between public and private has changed, specifically in the context of information and government and who controls your access to both. So we're going to go time traveling. Imagine, well, no, let's go today. It's the year 2000, and what year is it? 21? They all blend together, especially post-COVID. A politician somebody wants to run for Congress, wants to become a politician. They want the public to know their views. They want to engage in debate. They want you to know what their strong opinions are. What do? Where do they start? How do they go about informing everyone of their views? Twitter. So they use Twitter, or they use Facebook. Or Insta. And I'm sure we're soon going to start seeing TikTok. Like, if you don't, like the next election, you're going to see so many politicians doing TikTok dances. It's going to be out, like, as soon as the people who are, as soon as the generation of people who live on TikTok are able to vote, you will see Joe Biden doing all of the TikTok dances. Like, that is just a matter of time. So Twitter, Insta, TikTok, Facebook for the boomers. So these are the ways that you do it. You go through these sorts of social media. So generally speaking, it's just social media. Now let's go back to the year minus 55 BC. You're Julius Caesar and you want to start a career in politics. You want people to know your platforms. You want people to know what you stand for. Where do you go and what do you do? Yeah. Basically, in the center of Rome, there was a big square called the Forum, and at the front of the Forum was a big platform, and you would stand up there on this platform. You'd literally just get up there, and you'd stand in front of the crowd, and you would say your views. You would engage maybe in debates with other people on this big raised platform, but you just have a crowd of people, and you would speak out to them. So, in this case, who gets to hear you speak? So what determines who hears you or who gets to hear you? Yeah, who's physically there and who gets to be physically there? And who determines who's physically there? And to be clear, the Forum was like a public park. So who was allowed to be here listening to Caesar give his speeches?
Probably men.
So men, yes. In ancient Rome, it would have been men because it was a highly sexist society. But basically, anyone who had the legal right as a citizen. So any citizen was allowed to enter here and listen within this context. And everyone, no matter what their views were, heard the exact same things. It was a public space, and all you had to do to hear what this person has to say is be there and listen. And everyone heard the same message. Now let's contrast that with now. If you're a politician and you post things to Twitter or Insta or Facebook, who is hearing you? Your followers. So this is the key. It's not necessarily that not everyone can follow you. It's rather that who gets presented with your information first, and in what way is it presented to you? So for instance, if I wanted to say it's the year 2018 and I really wanted to know what Trump was tweeting, I don't have a Twitter. I could Google search it and find him. but it's much less convenient for me to get that information than it is for someone who follows at the real Donald Trump. So in some sense, even though all the information is out there, we aren't all receiving the exact same information because who you follow is going to affect that sort of thing. And not only is it who you follow, what else determines? So let's talk about Insta. Let's do Insta. Describe the Instagram interface. And I mean this like imagine I'm your grandparent. I'm going, I've never heard of Instagram. Explain it to me, young person. Explain to me how Instagram works. I'm just like, what is this thing that the youths are talking about? So explain to me how this works, as if you're a grandma.
There's a platform in which what it thinks you want to see, it will put at the top, and you can scroll on and keep continuing to see the things exactly what you want to see.
Sachi said it's like a magazine. So I open it and look at all the pretty pictures and it's the same for everybody? No. So Kiriaka says it's rather, so when you're on Instagram, so it has short and long videos and you scroll, and that last word is key. When you open Instagram, how many photos do you see? You see one. And yet how many photos are on Instagram?
Thousands,
billions. We're talking billions or trillions. Like billions, you maybe see one or maybe say like up to 3 depending on it, but you're not seeing all of them. So what determines which ones come up? Part of that is who you follow, but also even if you have like 40 people that you follow, you can't have all, or say you follow say 1,000 people and all of them have put up say 20 posts today. Well, that's 20,000 posts. You're only going to get say up to 3 of those at once. So which ones come out first? Yeah, so Instagram decides which ones to show you based on popularity of those videos. But it's not just popularity. How do they ultimately decide what video to put first or what picture to put first? What are they trying to calculate?
They're trying to calculate what you like.
What I like, or more directly, not necessarily even what I like, but what I will look at, and not only look at, what I will like enough that I will then scroll and look at something else. So for Instagram, TikTok, Facebook, what comes up? Oh yeah, the algorithm decides what I will watch for longest. So this ties back in, and this is our tie-in of data mining stuff that we talked about last week with the politics stuff of this week. So we talked about how data mining can be used to predict what you're going to buy and how you're going to buy it. But what they are also doing, so Instagram or Facebook also looks at what our interests are and things not just that we buy, but news articles we look at or videos we watch. And it has an algorithm which calculates what we will remain engaged with for the longest time or what other apps we're using, because it wants to calculate what is the best thing to show to us so that we will stay on Instagram for as long as possible. Why? Why do they want us to stay on Instagram for as long as possible?
To sustain their business.
Yes, it sustains their business by increasing the number of ads we see. The longer you're on Instagram, the more ads you see, which means more money for Instagram. So what we have here is unlike in ancient Rome, where if you got to the forum, you all got the same information. It all came to you from the same voice at the same time. Now what we see is these things are being filtered through a company which is controlling what shows up to you first, what you do see easily, and what takes more work for you to find. Curious.
I was just going to say, it's like a saying, it's when there's no product, you're the product.
Yes.
So I think what they try to do is take up as much time as possible just to filter as many ads as possible.
Absolutely. So yeah, you are selling Facebook your personal preferences. You pay Facebook, not in money, but in personal preferences. And then they use those personal preferences and they sell it to advertisers. So what you end up with is a case in which, unlike over here, we're all getting the same information. Nowadays, you are getting the information that Facebook or Meta, or which I guess is this one and this one. TikTok's owned by somebody else, and I think Twitter's their own thing. But there's 3 companies that are filtering for you using their algorithms what you see. So instead of everyone getting the same information, we all get slightly different information. Now, why is this a worry? What is the problem with all of us getting slightly different information? Now, on the one hand, it might not be like, you get shown shoes because you like shoes. I get shown socks because I like socks. Not a big deal, but there are problems. All right, got it.
Because I guess some people could consider it invasive.
So part of it is invasive, but let's just imagine for a second that everyone's cool with this catered experience. Even if we imagine every individual human is all right with it, it still has some kind of problematic worries. And what are those? Olivia?
No individual, like, not.
Yeah, so you're no longer in charge of looking at what you are no longer in some sense deciding in a conscious level what you read and what you don't read. It's instead being provided to you. And in a case in which it's shoes or clothes or things, it's affecting your judgments of buying. But that's not as scary as other things. Yet you're being coerced in a certain sense, in the sense of, I'm not sure if it's coercion, because coercion implies you're being forced, but at the very least, you're being put in a situation and you're far more likely to draw conclusions. Wait, say that again, Sasha?
I would also argue it is forced because we're not choosing, but they're just constantly showing it based on other things. So like, this was very interesting because I just got a puppy 3 months ago, right? So I did not ever use pet apps until 3 months ago. But as soon as I started using Chewy, I just got ads for everything everywhere. And now I want to buy everything. And I am just struggling.
I mean, fair enough. I feel the same way. And so, yeah, this is the thing, is it's basically when you're bombarded, and also if you have a puppy, you are probably having to spend a lot of time and energy training this puppy. And your decisions on what to buy are not going to be the most rational because the puppy keeps waking you up in the middle of the night.
Correct.
So So in some ways, you might, from a bird's eye view, say you have a choice. But if it's getting put in front of you like that, do you really have a choice? Now, we've been talking about purchases in this case, but think about the boomers for a second. The boomers who are on Facebook all the time, they're not just going on Facebook for advertisements and to see what their friends are doing. What else are they getting on Facebook? Mainly on Facebook these days. News. That's the key. You aren't just getting advertisements and things that you might like. You are getting news. And why does that matter? Why does it matter that the news is what's showing up?
It creates conflict to the point where people are completely different things from each other. And you ask yourself, why does everybody have a different opinion? Why can't we just have all the same information? Like, if all the same information is given to everybody, there'd be no conflict. But
yeah, and so this is the key. What do you need for a actually,
it helps to shape public opinion. If you're watching news, you're eventually being influenced by it. And now you're, as a collectively, if everybody's going on that platform, is having a separate public opinion.
Absolutely. And that's the key here, is it's not just the like cute pictures you're being shown or the cute clothes. It's rather you are being told based on what they judge you are most likely to be interested in is determining what news you're being presented with. And so, for instance, imagine there's a particular event that happens in which, say, a US military plane drops a bomb and it kills 80 civilians and also kills, say, 5 ISIS fighters. One news article is going to highlight the fact that 80 civilians were killed. And the headline will be 80 civilians killed in bombing. A different news site is going to say US kills 5 ISIS leaders. Those are going to be the headlines depending on what news site you're looking at. Now, if you were to read both of these articles, they will both further down contain the information that the other one contains. Probably, as long as they're reputable news sites. However, they will present the information very differently. So one of them, if you just read this headline, US kills 5 ISIS leaders, you are probably going to form a more positive view about the United States after this information comes across your viewing. If by contrast, you see the US kills 80 civilians, you are probably going to form a more negative opinion about the US than you would have before. And so which news is being presented to you is going to have impacts on your opinions. And this matters because what news gets presented is not going to be determined by what news is most accurate, or which is the one that is most fact-checked, or even which is the one that the most people have read. Instead, just as with what clothes you're going to look at or what dog toys, what's going to determine which news story you're shown? How is the Facebook algorithm going to decide whether to send you the news story that US kills 5 ISIS leaders or US bombs 80 civilians?
Based on past searches.
Past searches based on what you are going to spend longer looking at. So if you are somebody who already has negative opinions about the US, generally speaking, it's more likely to send you this one because you're more likely to read this one. If by contrast, you're someone who's very pro-USA, it's going to send you this one, which because you are going to spend more time looking. And if you get fed this one and you already feel somewhat positively about the United States, how are you going to feel after you read this headline? You already feel like the US is good. How are you going to feel now? You're going to feel great. You're going to be even more confident the US is a great nation. If by contrast, you started off thinking the US is pretty shitty, and then you read 80 civilians killed, how are you going to feel about the US afterwards? Even shittier. This right here is the way in which these Instagram social media filtering algorithms end up leading to these sorts of polarization in a way that wouldn't have been possible in earlier times. Now, there is what Netta said about in earlier times, only some people were allowed to be voters in the first place. But within the context of people allowed to vote, everyone was getting the same information. Nowadays, it's almost as if there's 2 platforms set up at any given time. And this person only hears the ones that agrees with them. This person only hears the one that agrees with them. And you end up with worlds in which people cannot even agree on the most fundamental facts to come to decisions in a public sort of setting.
Yeah, but the thing about that time is that you only got one version, and now even though you were only you only exposed to one, the other is still there for you if you do the research.
So that's the key, and I think that's a really good point that Netta brings up. Is there is a sense where if you want to do the research, the modern world will give you far more information than any time in the past, and you can be educated like never before. Back then, you only had one version of it. Nowadays, you can get multiple versions if you put the time in. The issue is how, so you can think of it as how informed are you about how the world is? If we go back to the year, say 40 or minus 55 BC, minus 55, or I guess it would just be BCE, 55 BCE, the lowest amount of information you can have is say about here. You can have this amount of information because everyone's getting the same information spoken to you. But because you only get one version of the story, you can also only get a high level here. Now, in the modern times, because there's so much information out there, you can be much more informed if you want. The problem is most people are busy and we are covered in so much information or just swamped in it that even though we could get higher than we ever could in the past, we can also get way lower. And so what you can end up with is, unlike in times in the past, while yes, you can get more information if you put the time in practice, so few people put the time in and instead don't even realize they're being filtered, that by the time you get the information, you've already been presented with one side of the story. So how is it that things like fake news are able to travel so much? Well, in some sense, it's because the algorithms are able to, and by fake news, I mean here, cases in which a news article is written that is false intentionally. It is designed to trick people into believing something. And so these sorts of fake news articles are able to get believed and spread very quickly because the algorithms are only presenting those articles to people who are likely to believe it. If you are somebody who is in no way going to believe that the vaccine has microchips in it, you are never going to see a news article claiming that the vaccine has microchips in it. If by contrast, you're someone who your past searches suggest you're into conspiracy theories, or you're open to certain sorts of viewpoints, you are going to be the one who's going to be shown those sorts of things. So even if there's something like problematic about the coercion that comes with sending chewy ads to somebody who's underslept and getting them to buy dog toys they don't necessarily need. It's still in some sense a personal level assault. In this way, what ends up happening is an entire society ends up in these sorts of bubbles where you're only getting certain sorts of information and not even being aware that there's other sides to the story.
Like social effect, political effect, like has like.
Absolutely. And so it ends up that you have people, why is it today that like the Republicans can, like, if you're a hardcore Trump fan, you cannot understand what the liberal Democrats are even getting on about. They must be insane. And if you are a liberal borderline socialist Democrat, you cannot even comprehend how the Trump fans came to believe what they did. And there's no context between them. Well, because for the past 10 years, you've been reading completely different things and have a completely different view on how the world works. And that's the way in which these sorts of things, through the filtering and through social media, are able to fundamentally change our relationship to how we get information. And it's a way in which things that used to be publicly accessed for better and for worse, now that they've been privatized, are being directed to us in ways that they never were before, both for better and for worse. You have a...
I was just wondering.
Yeah, you had a wondering face on.
Do you think that now we're more like, people tend to be more extreme and not like in the middle because of that?
So yes, I think that one of the main consequences of this is of these sorts of, we can think of these as like bubbles. One of the consequences of these bubbles is that people are becoming more extreme in their views. So like, why does it, like 25 years ago, you never would have found anyone in the United States who would, unless like on some college campuses you would, but the average person would never admit to being a socialist. And on the flip side, you would never find the number of people who are openly willing to support like Nazi memorabilia and Nazi images in public. Well, what has changed? Well, thanks to the internet, people who had somewhat liberal views went on to parts of the internet where the only news stories they were getting were pretty liberal. And so it was a bubble in which they were only getting that sort of information. And on the flip side, people who had white nationalist tendencies, white supremacist tendencies, were in their bubble only getting that information. And as a matter of fact, with human beings, and this is what we were talking about last time with social proof, the only information you're seeing is everyone agreeing with you. You believe it, you then come to the conclusion it must be right. If everybody's saying it, then it must be right. Not realizing that the only reason that everyone's saying it is that the people who you're interacting with are being given to you because they say this thing. So it creates this illusion of everyone believing it, when in truth, it's just everyone in your bubble. And on the flip side over here, why is it that you start to have stronger socialist feelings? Well, you've become polarized and become much more extreme by the fact that you're only talking about these groups of people. And so that is what is generally called group polarization. And this is polarization. And group polarization has always been a thing. So for instance, in things like sports teams and frats and those sorts of things, if it's an enclosed group, people will start to have more extreme views. And this is how you end up with cults with very extreme views. The difference is because of the internet, it is now much easier to end up with these enclosed bubbles, just because you now basically select who worldwide you get to interact with, because your selection is based on who you're connected to by the internet. So it ends up being very insular, and you only interact with people who begin with similar views to you, and then it gets stronger. And then as you end up with these incredibly polarized groups, it ends up making it wasn't always the case that Democrats and Republicans could not agree on anything. It's rather the fact is that as the two groups have become polarized, we're reaching a point in which, there comes a point in which if you cannot find compromise, what ends up happening is just chaos. So the US had a moment in which we had two sides that could not come to a common understanding because they just fundamentally disagreed. Anyone know what it was? 1861? Half the country said slavery was good. The other half said, no, it's not. They couldn't come to an agreement, so they fought a war for 4 years. That's the sort of thing that happens when sides cannot come to an agreement. I'm not saying that like whatever's going on now is going to lead to a civil war or anything like that. I mean, who the hell knows these days with the world as it is? But you know, I wouldn't, if I were a betting person, I probably would not bet on a vaccine war. Like, I don't necessarily think we're quite going to end up at the war level, but the same mechanism that led to a civil war is the same sort of thing of groups only talking with each other. And you can see how part of the reason that that happened is that geographically slavery was only in the South. So the people were talking only about other people in the South and started having stronger and stronger pro-slavery views. While in the North, people were only talking to other abolitionists and got stronger and stronger and more extreme. And eventually it got to the point that it turned into war because of the polarizing. The difference is instead of it being geographically based entirely now, it's now internet based and chat room based and what Reddit subthread you're on or subreddit you're on based. I have nothing else I need to add to this. Do people have any questions, comments, concerns, feelings about any of these things? I think that these are like the question of what has the internet done for democracy is a fascinating one. And I think that a lot of times the good, I mean, and for the early days of social media, the good was highlighted. But I think in the last 5 years, people have begun to see the negative sides. And the same things that make social media so good for getting any information you want can be exploited into manipulating people in any way you want. And just like we're now living in a propaganda age in which you can cater your propaganda to anyone you want to cater it to, thanks to these filters and everything else. All right. Then the last point I want to say is a business point. So what is next? Tuesday. We meet on Tuesdays. My brain is totally shot. I've been grading for like 3 days and I can't see straight. But next Tuesday is our next class. We're almost certainly not going to spend the entire class. Basically, what next class is going to be a class in which you get asked a lot to write papers in many classes. And one thing I've often found is many professors tell you to write a paper, and very few of us take the time to actually say why the hell we care and actually want you to write a paper, or what the point of them is, and what different types of papers are for, and why on earth, like, we don't just want to torture you, or at least many of us don't just want to torture you. So I basically just want to spend a class in which I actually put on in front of you all, like, why the hell I want you to write papers, which should give you a better idea of what a good paper would look like, given what I care about. Now, because of that, it's not going to take the whole class period. So anyone who has I will be here on campus. So if you want to come in person, and interact, totally fine. But if you're somebody who has to come in from home and it's inconvenient, and it would be much easier for you on Tuesday, if we're only going to be meeting for 45 minutes, to do it from Zoom, then I always give you permission to do it by Zoom, but I doubly give you permission on Tuesday to just not come in person, because it's not going to be a full class period. It's not going to be especially discussion based. It's just basically going to be, and it's also right before Thanksgiving. So if you're traveling. So yeah, I will see you all on Tuesday. I will be.
So we don't have class Thursday.
You do not have class on Thanksgiving next Thursday. Yes. Yeah, no class on Thursday. Go and celebrate genocide. Yes. Nothing quite like celebrating conquest and colonialism by eating so much turkey you fall asleep and throw up in your mouth. All right. I will be posting this video on probably tomorrow, as well as I forgot to record this on Tuesday, but I have older versions of it, so it won't be quite what we said, but it should be related enough that it'll help you. All right, have a great night, everyone. I'm going to stop the recording.